going to be telling you about my experience with the Canon EOS R7 over the past year, and everything you need to know about this camera before you pick it up. So let's get into the video. Let's talk about any build quality or software issues that I've had with this camera. As far as the build quality goes, there's only a couple scratches on the bottom of the camera and right by the lens mount. And this is either from me flicking the battery door open in the wrong spot, or from my fingernails digging into it just a little bit if I'm grabbing it too hard. Not really any issues at all. As far as software issues, I've only had a couple small issues, and that's where if I'm taking bursts on multiple cards at the same time, sometimes it gets a little freaked out about that and will say that I need to turn off the camera and turn it back on again. I only had this problem twice when I first bought the camera, and since I updated the software about 6 months ago, I haven't had any other software issues. Now, one thing that's regarded to maybe build quality or software is overheating. And for this camera, I have never had it overheat. I've been in very hot conditions, 80, 90 degrees, and sunny conditions, and I haven't had any issues. This camera may overheat when recording 4K 60 video when it's like 95 plus degrees, but that will happen with most cameras. But for most scenarios, overheating for this camera should not be an issue. Now let's move on to the feature set of this camera and what I've actually used. One of the big things that I talked a lot about this camera compared to the R8 and when I first got it is redundant recording. And this is super cool because you can have two SD cards in the camera and records to both at the same time. Awesome feature, but I tend to not really use it. Because if you just get a really good SD card, you shouldn't have any issues. And so far, I haven't had one scenario where I've had corrupted files from this camera. Always a good idea to do redundant, but not really necessary in the real world. But as always, for the safety of your photos, I do recommend it, but personally, never use it. Now, as far as battery life goes for photos and videos, I've been able to get from 6 to 8 hours, depending on what I'm doing, and this has been pretty consistent over the whole year. Now, for video, you should be able to get maybe 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours, depending on the settings. So pretty good battery life, especially for a camera of this size. Now, this is because it's using the Canon LPE6 batteries instead of the LPE17 batteries like the Canon R8. So awesome batteries. Now, if you want to extend the battery life even further, I have been able to use a V-mount battery with a dummy battery with this camera, and depending on the wattage, for example, a 50 watt-hour battery will last about 13 hours. So if battery life is a very key important feature to you, because they don't have a battery grip, you could use a V-mount battery, and it works well. It just is a little bit more bulky. Let's move on to the touchscreen. This is a 3.5-inch touchscreen that swivels around like this, so if you're using it for vlogging, you can see yourself, or if you're going down low or up high, you can see the camera in any condition. It's not amazingly bright, but it's decent enough that you can use it in direct sunlight without having any major issues. Definitely something that a lot of other cameras lack. A nice, bright, high-quality display that you can see anywhere. Other than that, almost everything about this camera is very similar to the Canon R6, R5, R8. It's a Canon camera in the R system. Not much is going to change. Let's move on to the main point, and that is the sensor and image quality. This has a 35 megapixel APS-C sensor with stabilization. And this is unique because it's the only 35 megapixel sensor that I know of in a Canon camera. See, most of the time Canon will share sensors between their cameras. For example, the R6 Mark II and the R8 have the same sensor, but this is the only APS-C sensor of that resolution. And that's really awesome. Because it's a higher resolution than something like the R6 Mark II, you can zoom in a lot to the photos digitally and it'll still look good. But the downside versus full frame is the loss in light. Because it's APS-C, it's 1.6 times smaller than full frame. And because of the higher resolution, it's also much smaller pixels. So overall, it's not going to do as well in low light as something like the R8 or R6 would, but it's going to be a lot better for sharpness during the daytime. But this also means you can use cheaper APS-C glass like the Sigma 18-35. And if you want to use full frame glass, you won't have almost any issues with vignetting because the sensor is smaller than full frame. And unlike the R8, the R7 has a stabilized sensor. And this is awesome because you don't necessarily need a stabilized lens for the footage to be relatively stable. Canon cameras have notoriously had this issue with the wobbles at the corner, and this is still very much present of anything wider than 18 millimeters. But other than that, maybe 35 or 50 millimeters, you shouldn't have any wobble issues, at least that are discernible to you. And as we discussed earlier, because this is an APS-C sensor, this is a disadvantage in low light performance, but it can be an advantage if you want a ton of zoom. For example, 100 millimeters becomes 160 millimeters because of that 1.6 times crop. Now, let's pull out a 600mm lens, this guy right here from Sigma. Now, because this is a 600mm lens on a APS-C sensor, this equals to be 940mm. But because we're 35 megapixels, if you want to crop in even more to that, you're well over 1000mm. And that's something that's just not obtainable on a full-frame camera. Now, this is a huge advantage for wildlife photographers and sports photographers. And because this camera has 15 frames a second mechanical shutter, you can get way more frames per second than an R6 Mark II at 12 frames a second, or an R8 at 6 frames a second. So if you're doing wildlife or sports, definitely something to consider because of that crop factor. But having that smaller sensor with smaller pixels will be a disadvantage in low light. And at something like f6.3 like this lens has at 940mm equivalent, it's not going to be very bright. And considering that certain sports like football are done in lower lighting conditions with a higher shutter, it's not going to perform as well as full frame cameras in that regard. So it really depends on the use case. So if you have a lot of light for sports and you want as much zoom as possible, this is definitely the way to go. But if you need that low light performance, something like the R8 or the R6 is going to be much better suited for you. Now let's move on to other aspects of photography other than just sports and wildlife. Now if you're going to be doing portrait photography or pet photography, basically anything in the 24 to 70mm range, this is going to be awesome. Just make sure to get a bright lens if you're going to do a lot of low light photography, and pay attention to that crop factor. Remember, it's 1.6 times, so 50mm becomes almost 85-ish millimeters. So just make sure when you're purchasing a lens to factor in the crop factor. Now let's move on to video. There are many different resolution and frame rate options, as well as the ability to record in C-Log3 or HDR-PQ. From my experience, I would recommend shooting in C-Log3 in Rec. 709. It's the easiest to grade, and you won't have any issues with any HDR formats like you will with HDR-PQ. Now, as far as resolutions go, I found that 4K fine at 24 or 30 frames a second will give you the sharpest image possible, but will introduce more rolling shutter. So if that's something important to you, just drop it down to 4K. And there's also IPB and IPB Lite compression. I'd recommend just going with IPB if you want the best image quality, but if you want to save some space, go down to IPB. For the price point, the R7 offers pretty much everything you need at 4K up to 60 frames a second and 1080p at 120 frames a second. I wish it had an option for external RAW recording, but that's something that they give to the more expensive cameras like the R6 Mark II, and I don't think Canon would want to give that capability to such a cheap camera. Overall, my experience over the past year has been awesome with this camera. I've used it for photos and video with all sorts of lenses and on a gimbal. If you have any further questions about this camera or any of the other gear we use, let me know in the comment section down below. If you want to pick up this camera for yourself, check out the Amazon affiliate links in the description below, and that helps out a ton. But before we go, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Artlist. If you're creative like myself on YouTube, or even have a large production company, you're going to need stock assets such as music, sound effects, and footage, and Artlist is the best place to get that. With different plans stemming from just music to Artlist Max with everything you need, Artlist is the place to go. If you want to get 2 months for free on your annual subscription, check out the link below. Thank you to Artlist for supporting the channel, and back to the video. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video, and that's awesome. If you want to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, that would help out a ton. And if you want to watch another video, there's one right over here and 2 below me. And let us know in the comment section down below what videos we should make next.